So I'm really thrilled that this seminar is taking place. I think it's critically important. Ethics and ethical questions arise in almost, well, actually, I won't say almost, I'll say in every major policy decision that we face, from questions about how to allocate scarce medical resources to questions about how to think about the level of funding for education. All those questions involve questions about values. There's a quote of Gladstone's I really like where he says budgets aren't simply matters of arithmetic, but they're matters of a society deciding where are its values and what are the kinds of trade-offs that it's willing to make. And what people who study ethics do is they try and identify what the values are that are important or at stake in a different policy arena, but they also try to identify what are important values. And then they try to say something about how those values are related to each other and how we might think about trade-offs among those values. And of course, there are a number of different theories about this. Not everybody agrees. Sometimes there's overlap, which is nice when all the different theories converge on an answer, but that doesn't happen as much as we would like. But at the very least, the different theories will tell you things, and then you can try and test in various ways the implications of the different theories by pursuing the implications and seeing how well they explain things you feel certain of. So I'm sure that all of you, or at least I hope that all of you think that slavery is wrong, right? As Abraham Lincoln said, if slavery isn't wrong, nothing is wrong. So if it turned out an implication of some theory was that it said slavery was permissible, you would revise your views. So we can try and do what's called a reflective equilibrium to see how well different theories account for our intuitions, but sometimes a theory just upends our intuitions, and then we have to make some policy choice. Ethics has had a lot of real-world implication and effects. So if you think I said about allocation of scarce resources in healthcare, there's the issue about how to measure, and we have QALYs, and we have other measurement tools that ethicists have designed. When we think about the economics of development, we have to think about how to measure what development is. That also has to involve questions of ethics. Is GDP the right measure of development? Are there other kinds of values or considerations that are not picked up by GDP? If we're interested in inequality, we have a choice of different measurement tools. We could use the Gini coefficient. We could use the Atkinson index. There are a variety of indexes. All the different indexes involve questions of ethics. So ethics has actually had a fair amount of effect, also in the ethics in the laws of war. But the environment is actually our hardest problem. Some people call the environment a perfect storm. That's a phrase that the philosopher Steve Gardner's used. And that's because in the case of thinking about changes to the environment, we're dealing with a lot of problems at once. So what are the problems? Well, we're dealing with disparate intergenerational effects. So our actions not only affect us, but they affect the future. Things that are good for us may be harmful for the future and vice versa. So we have the question about how to weight our interests and the interests of people who are not yet born. There's, in addition to disparate intergenerational effects, there's disparate intragenerational effects, because we know that different policies, including the policy of maintaining the status quo, have disparate costs and benefits to different people. And so people are differentially affected by the policies that we choose. As I think somebody once put it, Iowa's billion-dollar loss is Minnesota's billion-dollar gain. Now that's maybe not the most striking disparate effect, but there are serious disparate effects on different parts of the globe. In addition, there are disparate species effects. That's something we usually don't deal with in some of the other problems we look at, and how to think about those is a big question. Finally, there's questions about who decides and what a fair process of coming to a decision. If we have identified the values and we do have views about the trade-offs, what do we do? What are the right kinds of institutions, and how do we think about them, and what is then the scope of the possible? So there's some of these problems are shared with other areas where philosophers work, but there's some that are quite unique. And so it's a really, really hard problem. And today you're going to get a little taste of what philosophers do on this really hard problem with just respect to one policy question, which is the policy decisions in Pakistan about whether and how much to develop its energy. So with that, I will turn it over. Oh, no, but I won't yet turn it over because I want to make an introduction. So we're really lucky to have three very talented philosophers. I don't know if they're speaking in the order they're sitting, but I'll introduce them anyway. So there's Blake Francis, is a PhD student in the philosophy department who's writing his dissertation on some very hard questions about how to think about harm in the context of climate change. Hyun-Sap Kim is a postdoc in the Center for Ethics who has written on intergenerational issues about how to think about the future generation. He also is a lawyer and has a PhD in philosophy from NYU, as well as a law degree from South Korea. And Mark Budolfsson is also a philosopher who writes a lot on futility, which is how to think about your responsibilities when you're in a collective action problem and your own contributions don't mean that much. What ought you to do? And Mark has a PhD in philosophy from Princeton and is also interested in environmental issues. And with that, I will turn it over to Blake Francis. And here. And I'm, as I say, really happy that this is happening.
We're also really happy that this is happening. We're really excited for this opportunity to talk to you about energy ethics. Energy ethics is actually a very young subfield in applied ethics. And so we're excited to weigh in this sort of early stages of energy ethics. So our goal today is to raise a series of ethical questions that are brought up by the recent energy crisis in Pakistan. We realize that our talk might be a little out of the ordinary for the energy seminar, because we're going to spend very little time discussing the empirical facts about this case. There's a lot of engineers in the room, and I'm assuming that as engineers, when you're faced with a crisis, you naturally and rightly look for opportunities for technological innovation, solutions that will require getting the technical and the factual details right. However, I think in an energy crisis, in the context of climate change, there aren't just factual questions. There are political, social, and ethical questions intertwined with the factual. And we're here today to focus explicitly on the ethical. For the next hour, our objective is to draw to your attention the key ethical issues that arise within energy policy, and to ask you to reflect on the way that technological solutions involve judgments about values. So we could have chosen a number of different examples to use as our case study today. We chose Pakistan. And we chose Pakistan because we think that focusing on an energy crisis of such severity brings into stark relief the question of how to balance current needs with long-term sustainability. And we also think that the Pakistan case raises interesting questions about the role of emerging economies in preventing climate change. So Pakistan is a rapidly developing and rapidly urbanizing nation with a very young population. But due to several factors, Pakistan is currently facing a serious problem. It's in a low-growth, low-income trap that threatens its ability to grow fast enough to meet the demands of its young population. So one cause of this low growth rate is the increasing price of imported oil, which Pakistan has come to increasingly depend upon to meet its energy needs. This is as a result, in part, because their hydroelectric capacity has been diminishing. So these problems, combined with increased energy demands and several other factors, has resulted in a dramatic worsening of Pakistan's ongoing energy crisis. In 2012, load shedding went up to something like 20 hours per day in some areas. The rich have the resources to bear this crisis, and the portable generator has become a symbol of wealth and status in Pakistan. For others, and especially the poor, the crisis has deeply affected their productivity, their well-being, and that of their children. The energy crisis has also had a serious impact on industries, including major exports like textiles and fertilizers. And also, the energy crisis has resulted in extensive social unrest, including protests and violent riots over load shedding. So, as mentioned, diminishing hydro capacity and increased prices in imported oil have contributed to the severity of the energy crisis. And now we need to ask, how should this crisis be solved? Some in Pakistan have argued that the energy crisis should be solved with investments in renewables. Others note that Pakistan contains enormous untapped coal reserves. Currently, coal makes up only a very small portion of Pakistan's energy mix, and many argue that the solution to the crisis is to invest heavily in coal. In the summer of 2013, Pakistan announced that it will pursue a coal-intensive solution to the energy crisis. Pakistan's plan is to import coal and develop local coal reserves. They'll be retrofitting oil-fired thermal plants for coal and building new coal-fired power plants. Our panel discussion will consider two questions raised by the energy crisis in Pakistan. First, Mark and Hansup are going to consider, from a domestic perspective, what energy policy would be best for Pakistan's citizens. Mark will discuss ethics and enlightened self-interest, and then Hansup will talk about urgency and independence from Pakistan's point of view. The second question concerns the role of developing nations in burden sharing, and I'll be discussing that topic after Hansup. So, it's my pleasure now to introduce Mark, who's going to start us off talking about ethics and enlightened self-interest.
Thanks, Blake. In response to their energy crisis, Pakistani leaders decided to invest heavily in coal rather than renewables. Would you have made the same decision if you had to make this call on behalf of the Pakistani people? Why or why not? In answering a question like this about what should be done, one of the main points that we want to emphasize in our talk today is that even if we were somehow certain of all of the relevant empirical facts, that would not settle the question of what should be done, because there would still be room for disagreement about what values are relevant and how those values should be traded off against each other. To illustrate this idea that there are important questions about values that are not settled by the empirical facts, let's assume for the moment that we agree that investing heavily in coal maximizes Pakistan's GDP and also minimizes its domestic energy costs, as some experts have argued. Does this settle the question of whether it's in Pakistan's national self-interest to invest heavily in coal? It does not. Different people could agree about these and other important empirical facts, but disagree about what's in Pakistan's own best interests. For example, there are important objections to the view that nations should act to maximize near-term GDP and minimize energy costs. And this is true even though this is an influential view in practice about how nations should make energy policy decisions. To illustrate some of the objections to such a view, note that because it assumes that maximizing GDP in the short run is what is best for a nation, it assumes that costs and benefits in the future beyond the short run do not matter. And because it assumes that minimizing the market price of energy is what matters, it assumes that the externalities caused in the production of cheap energy do not matter. For example, by focusing only on actual market prices, it ignores the serious negative health effects imposed on citizens by using coal to generate electricity. At a more subtle level, it ignores the fact that investments in coal will lessen the value of other important national assets that do not have visible market prices. For example, it ignores the destruction of ecosystems that will be a consequence of coal mining in Pakistan's Thar region. Furthermore, because Pakistanis in that region have important cultural ties to their landscape, destruction of that landscape has important further costs to the nation that go beyond the more easily quantified aspects of ecosystem services. In addition to these negative impacts that are not reflected in market prices, there's also the controversial issue of whether beautiful landscapes and rich ecosystems have further value for their own sake beyond their possible use as a means to human welfare. Finally, metrics like GDP assume that only the aggregate wealth of a nation matters and not the distribution of that wealth. For one thing, this assumption will be rejected by anyone who believes that social justice is an important value that it's in a nation's interest to promote. And even if we set aside any concern for social justice, it's nonetheless widely accepted that promoting the welfare of a nation's own citizens is an important part of national self-interest. From any such perspective that includes concern for the welfare of citizens, ignoring the distribution of wealth is a mistake because doing so ignores the fact that generating an additional dollar of wealth for a poor citizen contributes much more to the aggregate welfare of a nation than generating an additional dollar of wealth for a rich citizen. For all of these reasons, GDP and actual market prices are widely viewed as highly imperfect proxies for national self-interest, especially when it comes to energy policy where externalities loom large and where assets not reflected in GDP are so dramatically important to correct decision-making. To make better decisions about energy policy and analogous challenges, many economists and philosophers argue that we need better metrics than GDP that properly account for the values that GDP ignores. Many such metrics are being developed, and they go under many different names depending on the particular values that are emphasized. For example, you may be familiar with full cost accounting, the Human Development Index, and many others. To give you an idea of how striking the difference can be between measuring national self-interest using GDP versus these other more enlightened self-interest metrics, check out the difference between GDP and the metric called the genuine progress indicator on this graph. This is for the United States. The difference here is disturbing. If the genuine progress indicator is indeed a more accurate measure of national self-interest than GDP, then the implication is that the United States is doing worse from a self-interested perspective over time, even while GDP is increasing in both per capita terms and in the aggregate. What's the upshot of all this for Pakistan? The important upshot here is that from the perspective of national self-interest, the answer to the question of whether Pakistan should invest heavily in coal would not be clear, even if it was clear that investments in coal would maximize Pakistan's near-term GDP and minimize its energy prices. On the contrary, a complete accounting of what is in Pakistan's enlightened self-interest could support the conclusion that it would be wrong to invest heavily in coal, even if doing so maximizes GDP. And to figure out how to do this kind of accounting, the main point of this section has been that we must answer difficult ethical questions that are not settled by the empirical facts or by market prices, including questions about what values are relevant and how those values should be traded off against each other. For example, in the case of Pakistan and coal, we have to decide whether the destruction of investments in coal power that destroy valuable ecosystems and ways of life within Pakistan are worth it, given the benefits to Pakistanis that cheap coal-based energy would provide. Benefits such as increased material well-being, better education, and other valuable things that can be purchased with cheap energy. Serious ethical reflection is needed to determine how to make such trade-offs, even from a self-interested perspective. With that thought, I will turn the discussion over to my colleague Hunsep, who will discuss issues of urgency of needs within Pakistan and considerations of its national independence that add a further layer of challenging ethical questions to the ones that I've already identified. Thank you.
So I completely agree with Mark that Pakistan's genuine national self-interest cannot be simply equated with maximizing its GDP.
Hold the microphone up.
Cannot be simply equated with maximizing its GDP and minimizing the energy price. However, we would be losing sight of a number of important values if, from this enlightened view on national self-interest, we jump to the conclusion that Pakistanis should stay away from coal and go for renewables immediately. They are protesting over the hike in energy prices with their electricity bills in their hands or burning the bills. Presumably, each and every Pakistan person has a right to the minimal amount of energy necessary for their subsistence. This right has priority over many other considerations. Indeed, one might reasonably argue that it is justifiable, or at least excusable, for Pakistanis to acquire this subsistence energy by any means, including, of course, burning coal, even if they might wind up harming others as a result. As with an act of self-defense that ends up injuring the aggressor, they are within their rights to do what is necessary for their survival. At the social level, as opposed to the individual's rights perspective, it arguably underestimates the urgency of Pakistan's energy crisis to say that it is in Pakistan's long-term interest to stay away from coal-burning power plants. Pakistanis are protesting over their government's inept response to the energy crisis. Burning tires and this guy with light bulbs around his body. Protesters torched police vans, attacked banks, and looted shops. Indeed, the house of a congressman of the ruling coalition was attacked, and his personal guards opened fire into the crowd, killing 2 people. They are now under a serious threat of uncontrollable social disorder, a catastrophe that they should avoid at almost all costs. If the energy crisis-induced social unrest ends up destabilizing the government, law and order, or the social fabric that makes productive social cooperation possible, it might take a very long time to recover, and the enormous loss from social disorder might not be compensated by the payoff of renewables now rather than a bit later. No one denies that dependence on coal-burning power plants results in some externalities. For one, heavy usage of coal will pollute the air in the region and take its toll on the residents' health. Pakistanis also see the value of natural beauties and the traditional ways of life that are endangered by intensive coal use. However, it is the job of Pakistanis and their government, not of some random environmentalists or economists from Western countries, to decide how much value to attach to Pakistan's nature and cultural heritage and how to protect Pakistan's environment and prevent domestic externalities. If Pakistanis are left alone, free from the imposition of the bottom line that Nobel laureates in economics have figured out on their behalf, they will take care of those values on their own terms. And do we really believe that we know what's good for them better than they themselves do? Only when Pakistanis overcome the energy crisis and keep their economy up and running can they take this long-term perspective. So the value of natural beauty and environmental protection gives more, not less, reason to let Pakistanis solve the problems on their own initiative. As Blake pointed out, Pakistan's government recently decided to meet their urgent energy needs by using coal. It is reasonable to take that decision to mean that they have attached more value to securing a well-functioning society now and given priority to the protection of those poor citizens for whom coal is the only affordable source of energy. Our job is to respect their decision and keep our fingers crossed for them, not to impose our calculations on them. In 2010, heavy floods in Pakistan affected more than 20 million people, over 10% of the total population, and killed more than 1,700 people. The floods are arguably attributable to climate change. Given their vulnerability to climate change, Pakistan people may be willing to reduce their coal usage, at least in the long run, and mitigate the natural disasters. However, if Pakistan stops burning coal and contributes to the mitigation of climate change, the burden falls only on them while the benefits are shared across nations and over generations. Even if Pakistan using renewables rather than coal would increase total global welfare, it is unreasonably demanding and arguably unfair to ask Pakistanis to take unilateral actions to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and pay for the full cost. So, one way of summarizing what I've argued for is to say that externalities to other countries cannot be Pakistan's primary concern for the following reasons. A, individuals' right to subsistence energy. B, the serious threat of a social chaos. C, respect for the autonomy of Pakistan's energy policy. And D, the unfairness in demanding Pakistan to take unilateral action on climate change. At the same time, I admit that it may be a quite different story if there were to be a global cooperative scheme over climate change. For example, an international climate treaty waiting to be ratified by Pakistan. Then Pakistan probably will and arguably should come to the international negotiating table and discuss its share of climate burden. This opens up a host of issues that I cannot properly address, but maybe Blake can.
We'll see how well I do addressing them. So Pakistan's coal-centered energy policy comes at a time when there's urgent calls to move away from coal. Activist organizations like Greenpeace and 350.org have been campaigning around the world for the end of coal. And much more seriously, the World Bank recently announced that it would no longer fund coal projects except for in very rare circumstances. As a Pakistani environmentalist said, the world is divesting in coal, and Pakistan is doing the opposite. In light of these observations, I'd like to raise a question. Is Pakistan ethically obligated to the world to implement no new coal energy policies? This is a question about distributive justice. It's a question about how to fairly share the costs of emissions reductions across the world. There's a lot of disagreement about how this question should be answered. I'm going to consider a very small portion of this disagreement, and I'm going to try to lay out both sides along a particular axis. So let me begin with a claim made a few moments ago by Hunsep. He said that maybe it would be unfair to obligate Pakistan to bear the costs of emissions burdens. One reason that might support this claim is that other countries have contributed far more to the global emissions than Pakistan has. As you can see on this map of CO2 emissions, Pakistan's emissions are rather small in comparison. So, in support of this claim that's on the table, that Pakistan is not obligated to mitigate, we can actually appeal to a principle. We can appeal to the polluter pays principle, a principle of distributive justice that simply says those who caused the problem should pay. In the context of climate change, polluter pays requires that those who are responsible for causing the climate change problem should bear the burdens of both reducing the emissions and protecting people from its bad effects. This means, first, that due to its vulnerability, Pakistan should be compensated for the costs of adapting to climate change. And it means, second, that if Pakistan agrees to reduce its emissions under this possible treaty, global treaty, it's well within its rights to demand compensation for its mitigation efforts. So now I've just argued that Pakistan is not obligated to implement no new coal policies without compensation. But I think there's reasons to think that emerging economies like Pakistan should bear some of the costs of emissions reductions. One reason to think this is that there are many high emitters in developing nations, and there are probably many high emitters in Pakistan. For example, a third of Pakistan's energy demand comes from air conditioners, a luxury that many Pakistanis can't afford. So we should ask, would it be fair if high emitters in Pakistan benefit from low energy policies under Pakistan's coal-intensive policy? Or are these polluters who should also pay? This points to a problem with the polluter pays principle. When it's applied to countries, it lets high-emitting individuals in especially emerging economies off the hook. So in response to this problem, we can revise the polluter pays principle so that it applies to individuals instead of countries. Doing so will ethically obligate high-emitting individuals in Pakistan to reduce their emissions. Now, a second reason to think that emerging economies like Pakistan should bear emissions burdens concerns the urgent nature of the climate change problem. Now, suppose you think that there's a significant but not well quantified chance that climate change will be catastrophic, that it'll be so catastrophic that it'll destroy the world for all of its inhabitants. In short, you might think that we face a climate disaster and that we must do whatever we can to prevent it. In the face of such a serious emergency, it would be highly inappropriate for a nation to say, you broke it, it's not fair for you to look to us for help fixing it. This kind of response, you might think, is especially inappropriate given that developing countries are expected to take up a large portion of the emissions budget into the future. So in the face of this emergency, one could argue that Pakistan should quit coal, whether it's fair or not, and that they should do it out of an incredibly strong obligation to prevent an urgent, devastating disaster, a disaster that Pakistan itself is highly vulnerable to. So now I've just sketched reasons that support both answers to this question about Pakistan's global ethical obligations. I've considered arguments on both sides. According to the polluter pays principle, Pakistan has no obligation to reduce its emissions or quit coal, and is actually owed compensation for its adaptation costs and whatever mitigation efforts it ends up taking on. I then considered an opposing position. I discussed an argument for revising the polluter pays principle so that it applies to individuals and would require high-emitting individuals to pay, no matter what country they're citizens of. Finally, I considered the idea that our obligation to prevent climate change emergency is so strong that it outweighs these considerations of fair burden sharing. So we've made some progress in answering this difficult question about Pakistan's obligations when it comes to sharing burdens across the world. But there's still more work to do. We need to ask ourselves what side of this debate we think is reasonable. And to do that, I think there's further questions that we need to find answers to, further questions that require careful thought and reflection. So one question is about who should be held responsible for climate change. Is it countries who should be held responsible, or is it individuals? Second, we need to know when the need to solve urgent problems is weighty enough to override claims of distributive justice. These are hard ethical questions, and I raise them for your further consideration. And now I would just like to welcome Mark back, who's going to lead us in some conversations for our conclusion.
Thanks, Blake. In our talk today, we've investigated the question of whether Pakistan has an ethical obligation to implement no new coal energy policies. And we've considered this question from a number of different perspectives. We first investigated this question from the perspective of Pakistan's own national self-interest. And we saw that even from that perspective, difficult questions arise about what values are relevant and how to make trade-offs between those values. For example, we used ethical reasoning to clarify problematic assumptions in the view that national self-interest is simply a matter of maximizing GDP and minimizing energy prices. And we noted that a more enlightened view about national self-interest might lead to very different policy decisions than the view that we should always maximize GDP. More generally, it's important to see that cost-benefit analysis in any form is not value neutral and always involves at least implicit assumptions about values and how to weigh them. We then investigated Pakistan's ethical obligations from a broader ethical perspective that took seriously the global challenges associated with climate change. We highlighted important questions about global justice and our obligations to the rich and poor in developing countries that arise in connection with this very complex problem. As Pakistan's energy crisis illustrates in a striking way, even if we care about fairness, global justice, and taking responsibility for our actions, it's not obvious how to think our way through to conclusions about what developed and developing nations should do about climate change. In response to our discussion of all this today, some of you might wonder what relevance our talk has to you personally, especially if your work is not particularly focused on ethics and public policy. More pointedly, Some of you may think that realistic solutions to climate change are not a matter of ethics or perhaps even public policy, but are primarily a matter of technological innovation. Or less pointedly, some of you may think that even if solutions to climate change require ethics and policy in addition to innovation, your job as innovators does not really have any personal connection to these questions about ethics and policy. With that in mind, the last thing we want to stress today is that analogous considerations of values and trade-offs are essential to questions about what you as an individual should do, just as they are essential to questions about what nations should do. For example, just as ethics highlights the problematic assumptions of the view that nations should always act to maximize GDP, so too ethics highlights the problematic assumptions of the view that individuals should always act to maximize their own wealth when they're making choices such as what career path to pursue or any other decision. In both cases, ethics helps us see that there are other values beyond wealth maximization that seem important to us even from an enlightened, self-interested perspective, and that questions about what weight to give to these values cannot be settled by empirical investigation alone. Instead, rigorous ethical reflection is required about what really matters, in addition to the kind of rigorous empirical investigation that may be more familiar to many of you. To illustrate these issues about the ethical obligations of individuals, let's reflect for a minute on a quote that's etched in this very building, right at the top of the stairs that lead down to this lecture hall. We may learn something about the renewal of societies if we look at the kind of people who contribute most to that outcome, the innovators. All of you have walked past these words many times during your time at Stanford. Why do you suppose it was so important to the innovators who paid for this building to have this quote etched in stone here? What values, if any, are they encouraging you to endorse by placing this quote in a place of great prominence? More generally, what values lie behind the decisions of the greatest innovators? Is their goal always to maximize their own wealth? Or are they happy to leave some money on the table if it means a higher likelihood of changing the world for the better? When you think about the values that these innovators endorse, what values do you want to guide your own lives? Is it important to you that your work has a positive impact on the world? These are important ethical questions that we all have to answer over and over again throughout our lives. When you answer these questions, you'll have to decide how your decisions about how to invest your time and your efforts should be influenced by the fact that many of the world's biggest problems can be solved by technological innovation that removes the need for the kind of tragic trade-offs between important values that we highlighted in connection with Pakistan's energy crisis. If innovation has the power to solve these enormous problems, what does that mean for those of us who have the potential to be innovators? Without trying to answer these deepest of questions, let me conclude by reiterating our main point from today, which is that ethics are important and that ethics are essential to thinking rigorously about what should be done about the world's biggest problems and in our own lives. Thank you. You can do that.
Thank you, guys. That was fabulous. Okay, we have questions. And as usual, we can start with students first. Let's see if there are any students who have questions to ask. Yeah, okay, all right, please, sir.
One other point which you maybe didn't touch on is the age distribution of the population in different countries. So Pakistan, you said, was the average age, median age of 22. So on average, the people who are living in Pakistan now did not contribute very much to the CO2 in the atmosphere. And to Pakistan as a country, the people are not responsible Whereas here in this country, or especially in Europe, where we're on average much older, individuals living today had a much bigger responsibility for what went on. So when you assess who is responsible, you could look at the living people now, how responsible they were, or you could look at generations up to now, like we here benefit because of our grandmothers and stuff polluting. There's many more aspects to this than you mentioned.
I'm assuming this is a question for me, and I completely agree with you that there was a lot of aspects of the debate about the polluter pays principle that I did not mention, and I appreciate you for bringing them up. I think it's a really interesting question whether when we apply this principle, we apply it only to living people, or we apply it to generations going all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. One version of the principle, I think, might respond to one of your concerns, and that's a version of the principle that's sometimes called the beneficiaries should pay. So those who have benefited from growing up in a developed, industrialized country have a special responsibility that even maybe the highest emitters in a developing country don't have. And so I think we could reflect more about maybe whether that's the principle that we'd like to use in supporting our arguments for who's responsible for climate change.
Talking about the highest emitter should pay or so-and-so should pay, why not everyone take a part and why not everyone pays? The two socialists.
Repeat the question.
So she asked, we're trying to figure out who should pay. Why not just say everybody? Everybody should pay. Is that right? Okay. So I think there's a really important issue that might need a little bit of emphasizing when we think about who should be held responsible, and that is the issue of wealth distribution and capacity. And so there's sort of a famous distinction made by a philosopher named Henry Shrew. I guess he wasn't the original person to make this distinction, but he made it famous. And he made the distinction between luxury and subsistence emissions. And if there's people who are living below the poverty line or near below the poverty line or below the poverty indicator of your choice, you might be really concerned that if we asked them to pay, we would be worsening their destitution. So I think there are these interesting questions to ask about how to balance responsibility against maybe capacity or even capability.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to this, which is that a person could agree that Pakistanis have no responsibility for the problem, the young ones, and in some sense shouldn't have to pay anything to solve the problem. But they could also think that the fact that there's a global emergency that absolutely has to be solved is sort of like a more important problem than the problems of distributive justice. And so if in practice what we need to do to solve the emergency is make everyone pay, then maybe that's what we should ultimately do, even if there's still a sense in which that's unfair, and so we shouldn't have to do that.
So I agree that there's a lot to be said for the idea that, yes, everybody on Earth is responsible when it comes to climate change. But responsibility needn't be understood as an all or nothing matter. Maybe it's a matter of accounts about responsibility allocation can be understood as saying, yes, these kind of people are more responsible than others.
Okay, way in the back there, yeah, and then.
So I don't know that much about philosophy, and I understand with this debate, we're trying to go back to principles and not include a lot of empirical analysis. But looking at the two trade-offs, it seems to me that ultimately it comes down to a matter of cost. When you're looking at renewable energy versus coal and so on and so forth. So given that they both can do the job, and it's a matter of cost, how can you derive any sort of conclusions without including at least an empirical assessment of the costs of one versus the other.
So one question would be when you say it's just a matter of costs, I'm guessing you have something in mind like it's just a matter of the true economic costs when all externalities and other things of economic value are taken into account. One question is whether that view is right. Some people might object that there are further values that we should care about beyond anthropocentric values that serve human interests as reflected in economic values. But even if we agree with that, one thing to emphasize is that the question of how to figure out what maximizes economic benefits requires answers to very difficult questions about how to quantify the relevant values and properly account for them. And that accounting is not generally properly done by historically influential models. Or that was the argument in that section.
It wasn't purely economic cost. The last few questions have been who will pay. So then when we ask who will pay what? Is it a dollar amount? Is it a social amount? Whatever it is, shouldn't we have a sense of quantifying what that is in order to answer that question?
Yeah, looks like you're getting a nod of agreement. Okay, how about, you?
Yeah, so my question's not that interesting anymore because it was basically the same thing. As an engineer, I guess a lot of these issues are things that that I had thought about, but always with the sense of I don't know how to measure those things against each other. And listening to your talk, it seems like, especially following the progression of the storyline, that you start with a development index. You have to pick the correct one or a correct one for the circumstances, and whether it almost felt like okay, there's some sense of you could say beyond a certain threshold of development as measured by whatever index you pick, right? Below that threshold, whatever countries are below there, develop as you go, right? They should be free to do whatever, to have lighting for their school books and all the pictures and stuff. But and so that's one way to quantify it. But then is there, when people make decisions, especially in terms of policies and things that affect the world, like again, as an engineer, I don't know that much about it, but is there stuff that's being done in terms of quantifying anything beyond that, right? Beyond the development index, and maybe it is an economics cost taking into account all externalities and everything else, like you said, and values, but I don't know, can you speak to that maybe?
I'm not an expert on that question, but my impression is that we're making a lot of progress in quantifying the relevant things, and there's a lot more pressure than there used to be to include them in a full cost accounting when we're making policy decisions. But we still have further to go, but now there's more energetic people working on, trying to figure out how to do it right, or maybe how to do it in practice in the best way that we can is maybe the more relevant thing. And I think that's really exciting, but it does require careful ethical thinking to really make genuine progress on doing it right, I think, and that was kind of the thing I wanted to emphasize in that first section.
So what we've been arguing for is not incompatible with some cost-benefit analysis in some broad sense, meaning we should systematically compare the benefits and costs of alternative policies. But what we are questioning is whether all the values can be quantifiable in monetary terms. So maybe by cost, we mean different values that are put together, and it might make things better if we articulate those values and separate them from each other.
Okay, how about you with the red shirt and the dark shirt?
When you think about these sorts of agreements, and if we're ever in a position to think about and negotiate these sorts of agreements, how do you think about balancing what you think is right with what you think everyone will agree to and will pass the agreement?
That's one of my favorite questions. I think that's really the thing that struck me most about this case, and is why why I'm compelled by this question that you asked so much too, which is we all care about fairness, or many of us care about fairness, global justice, but then to solve this catastrophic threat to humanity, we might have to do something that's really unfair. So now we have these two different values that are pulling in different directions. How do we make that trade-off? That's a really tough question. I could talk to you about that for hours, I bet, longer than you'd be interested, but yeah.
Okay, how about, actually, you way in the back, get your hand up? Yeah, you, and then we'll come up, and then that will be the last one, right?
It's kind of related to the last question, but you raised a lot of questions, but what advice would you give to these UN negotiators when they're going to Kyoto or Rio or Cancun? What advice would you give them so that they actually can come to some agreement? Because they're obviously all going to have different ways of looking at this problem, and they're not going to even agree that what's ethical to one country would be ethical to another country.
I think that's a really, really difficult question. And there's a lot in your question as well.
And difficult to answer in 30 seconds.
Right. And so I think when it comes, I mean, there's a question about what advice would I give policymakers about what the right thing to do about climate change is. That's one question. And then the question about what would I say to individual policymakers who are going into this really intense negotiating session is I think it's a totally different kind of question. That kind of question is kind of like a question about how to accomplish the most in really non-ideal circumstances. And I think it's a really difficult one, and I don't personally know how I would answer that, but I'm going to think more about it.
Okay, and this will be the last word other than mine.
My attempt at saying something helpful about what I think really quick would be the US needs to find ways of committing itself to making reductions over the long term that are consistent with the fact that the Senate seems unwilling to ratify any agreement. So I think that there are actually promising ways that a US president committed to taking leadership could accomplish that, but hard to summarize quickly, but I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Okay, well, I hope this is just the beginning of a long conversation about energy and ethics. I want to thank our panel. They've done a marvelous job. They came together to bring this to you, and thank you so much. More than